ومن أحسن قولا ممن دعا إلى الله وعمل صالحا وقال إنني من المسلمين.
Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Alhamdulillah wa salatu wa salamu ala rasulillah wa ala alihi wa sahbihi wa mawalah ma ba'd. I am very, very humbled and honored to have a very frank one-on-one conversation with Imam Zaid Shakir. Alhamdulillah, I consider him to be one of the... No, let me actually change that. No, I'm going to be brutally honest. I know Imam Zaid is listening on the other line, but this isn't for him. This is for our viewers here. In this entire country that we live in, amongst the Islamic leadership, unequivocally and unconditionally, I consider Imam Zaid Shakir to be the leader of American Islam in terms of every single meaning that the term leader has. And if there was any issue that troubles me about the future of what we should be doing, about the direction that we would be taking, I would consider Imam Zaid to be the person that I personally turn to. And this is before what's going on. This is before the crises. And I say this not ta'udhu billah to inflate his ego or something. He's a very, mashallah, humble Shaykh. But in order so that we underscore that, people like Imam Zaid, they have things that none of us can possibly have. Age, experience, wisdom, what he's gone through, his life transitions. These are things that you don't learn from books. And so Imam Zaid is somebody that I consider genuinely to be a person that is not just a leader, but if anyone were to be the leader of the direction of American Islam, somebody who's balancing very well between the tradition and the heritage that we have as Muslims, along with being in this land, along with understanding the social and the political contours of what we're facing, there is no one that is more qualified, in my humble opinion, than Imam Zaid Shakir. So it gives me great honor and pleasure to welcome Imam Zaid to our platform. Assalamu alaikum, Imam Zaid. Can you hear me?
Wa alaikum assalam wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Yeah, I heard you, so
Alhamdulillah. Alhamdulillah. That's okay, Shaykhana. That's okay. It wasn't meant for you, that the previous bit. Alhamdulillah, Shaykhana. We're very, very honored that you took time out. I know you've had an interview earlier today. You have another one in an hour or so. So we're going to literally jump straight in, Imam Zaid. I know that time is limited. And I have a number of questions that I want to ask you. All of these questions, by the way, have been submitted online via Facebook and social media. So I'm literally just going to be asking you these questions that have been submitted by our viewers. Firstly, Shaykhana, as an introduction, can you remind us about the year that you converted to Islam? And also, we haven't really heard, many of us, some of your own anecdotes and experiences as an African-American convert and having to face some of the stereotypes and, let's be honest here, the racism from even within our community. So I'm going to ask you a very frank question to open up this entire interview with your own personal anecdotes that you'd like to share with us.
Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Alhamdulillahi Rabbil Alameen. Wassalatu wassalam ala Sayyidil Mursaleen, Sayyidina Muhammad wa alihi wa sahbihi wa sallam. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. First of all, I'd like to thank Shaykh Yasir for setting this up. Allah reward him for all that he does for the community, and thank all of the brothers and sisters who are viewing this conversation, taking time from your busy schedules and really showing your desire to really seek guidance in a time of crisis. And I think this is something all of us are doing. So I converted in 1977, alhamdulillah. When I converted, I converted at a time there really weren't very strong bridges between what might be referred to as sort of the immigrant-based community and the community of African American converts. At the time, my view of Islam had been shaped growing up by the Nation of Islam. We thought Islam was the nation. They were the ones coming through our neighborhood selling fish. My mother would buy the newspaper when she didn't have a quarter for the newspaper. The brothers would give her the newspaper for free. We'd buy the fish when they had the Whiting H&G program. Fish being imported first from Japan, then from Peru, and mass. And that was the primary source of protein in the diets of a lot of people. We saw people that were gangsters being cleaned up. And so we thought that was Islam. We thought it was a very socially active religion. When I converted into the community that for a period of time. Worked at Muhammad. At the time, it was called the War Community of Al-Islam, the West. And then I became a Bilalian, so that was a big thing back then. And then when I grew in Islam and went through my education, I spent time in Turkey. I was in the Air Force when I converted. I was actually in the Air Force. I asked to get out. They said there's no war. This was post-Vietnam, 1977. I asked them to send me to a Muslim country. They happily obliged before I changed my mind, because no one wanted to go to a Muslim country, even a place like Turkey, because even though it was secular, it was still 99% Muslim. You couldn't date the girls. There were no wild nightclubs you could go to. So anyway, they sent me before I changed my mind. I had a wonderful experience. When I came back, we started a masjid in New Haven, Connecticut. It was primarily founded by people who had converted, people who had grown out of the nation, people who had been affiliated with the movement of Prophet Mohammed. Bottom line, for most of my I could divide my Islamic life into two parts: pre-Syria, going to Syria to study, and post-Syria. Pre-Syria, we had very little interaction with what might be called the immigrant community. And what interaction we had, we were pretty much taking the lead and doing things in the New Haven community, even with the West Haven Masjid with Shaykh Yasir. You're very familiar with the community there. So there really wasn't much opportunity to experience what a lot of converts, a lot of African-American Muslims, Latino converts complain about contemporarily. I'll say something else also, and this is my personal experience. I don't want to extrapolate from my experience to delegitimize any Islam. It saved my life, and it was so powerful. I couldn't even talk about it for about 18 months. I would just break down into tears. We sometimes have these gatherings and everyone's bearing witness, and I could not bear witness. And so it was a powerful experience, and I would not have noticed any kind of negativity, because that experience was so powerful and so transformative that the light from that was so powerful, it wouldn't have allowed any of the darkness of negativity. And like I said, I don't extrapolate from my experience to delegitimize or dismiss anyone else's experiences. I've heard enough horror stories, enough stories of being alienated, enough stories of being marginalized and dismissed to know that the discrimination in many of our masjids and centers is real, and that's something we have to address. And this moment is perhaps one of the most suitable moments to address it.
Alhamdulillah, alhamdulillah. So it's nice to hear there are positive stories as well, alhamdulillah. And of course, Shaykhana, it's interesting that Masjid al-Islam, which you founded, the year that you left is the year that I came to New Haven. And so we have that connection as well. The khutbahs I would give when I was in New Haven at Yale was at Masjid al-Islam. And so we had that overlap as well. Shaykhana, the second question we have comes from one of our viewers who says that we know for a fact that, and again we're being honest here, that Muslims in the US, they come from two very different and extreme socioeconomic backgrounds. On the one hand, we have the extremely wealthy, and the other hand, we have the extremely impoverished. And of course, generally speaking, the wealthy are from an immigrant background. They tend to be highly educated professionals. They tend to live in the suburbs. And of course, those that are on the other side of the spectrum tend to be from within the African American community and living in the inner city. And the fact of the matter is that their worlds rarely intersect together. And so what can be done, Shaykhana, about the fact that we have these two completely almost disparate communities that have so many differences socioeconomically, education-wise, ethnically. What are some of the practical steps that we can take to kind of bridge that divider gap that we all know exists?
Okay, Alhamdulillah. I think first of all we have to acknowledge that there are differentiations in societies, and those are historic and they're ongoing. وَجَعَلْنَا بَعْضَكُمْ لِبَعْضٍ فِتْنَةً أَتَصْبِرُونَ. Some of us have been made as a trial for others, and we have to patiently endure the difficulties that come through that. So the immigrants can be a trial for the inner city Muslims and vice versa. So we have to acknowledge that and recognize that perhaps there's a wisdom in that. And in the sense that there has to be a division of labor. And there are advantages that Muslims in inner city communities, primarily African American, not exclusively, have an increasingly large community of Latino converts in many of our inner city areas, especially on the West Coast. Also, so there are advantages. When I was in New Haven, for example, we got front page cover for all of coverage rather in the New Haven Register, second largest paper in the state of Connecticut, because one of our sisters who was a convert, her best friend was an assistant editor at the New Haven Register. And so she would just call a friend up, listen, next week's our holiday, show us a little love, and we get beautiful pictures. We get the Muslim maniac.
So we seem to have some technical issues.
Sort of connections that converts bring with them into Islam, and they're still there, and there's something we can take advantage of. On the other hand, as you mentioned, Sheikh Yasir, generally the suburban communities are wealthier communities, and so they have the advantage of material resources. And we can bring those together in beautiful ways. I think it's not necessary for us to think of ways of leveling or negating those very real realities, and also not negating the nuances. Generally, the community of Imam Prophet Mohammed is more established and tend to be more middle class, upper middle class within the African American community, very different from a lot of the more Sunni, more orthodox, if you will. This is an orthodox group, but you know what I'm saying, Sunni groups, which tend to be, the Darul Islam was focused heavily on ex-convicts, or people, I shouldn't say ex-convicts, formerly incarcerated individuals, a lot of dawah in the prison. And so those, that community tend to be a lot more poor than the community of the Imam Prophet Muhammad. Similarly, due to our recent wars, a lot of our more recent immigrants tend to be poor, such as Somalis or the Iraqi Kurds, and others who tend to settle in our inner city communities and deal with a lot of the inner city issues to a certain extent that some of the more established African American communities deal with. So there's a lot of nuance. The bottom line is we have to bring it all together, recognizing the differences, but understanding we're all on the same team. And I can give you a few examples of how it can be brought together. In Oakland, through the Lighthouse Masjid.
Again, sorry guys, we seem to have technical issues with the transmission from his side.
So Lighthouse Mosque established a zakat program of 2 suburban communities, the Muslim Community Center, MCC, and San Ramon Valley Islamic Center, SRVIC. And that program, over the last several years, we probably distributed upwards to $500,000 in zakat to
MashaAllah.
inner city Muslims and to assist in inner city projects. The masjid itself, our fundraisers were primarily supported by those suburban Muslim communities. And so there's a working relationship between the 2 communities. So, and there are other places where similar things are happening. So I think that is very important. Iman is an example in Chicago, the inner city Muslim action, that we're working in the inner city, but drawing on a lot of the human and material resources of the suburban communities to do some real groundbreaking work. So these differences are real. I don't think it's necessary for us to try to level these communities, but it's important for us to realize we're all on the same team. And the visionaries on both sides have to work to establish functional programs to bring the strengths of those two communities together.
MashaAllah. So if I can just rephrase, Shaykhana, is that, MashaAllah, what you're saying is that this diversity is actually, we can use it as a positive and as a strength. And each one has its pros. And I really like the fact that you mentioned the issue of zakat, because all too often the immigrant communities, or us children of immigrants, we prioritize giving zakat overseas, and yet there are so many people that are mustahiq of zakat within our own communities, if only we're to build bridges between them. Jazakumullah khair.
And education, one of the foundational educational pieces, just mentioning the rule.
So this is the connection from his side, guys, sorry. Bismillah.
Distant land. And when we explained that, the lights went on, and then it became very easy for people to say, if I don't give all of my zakat for the needy people in these 8 categories in my area, I'm going to give a good part of it. So I think we have to really educate each other and listen to each other.
طيب, Jazakallah khair. Shaykhana, we have a question from a sister who is obviously from the generation, basically our generation, born and raised here, and she's saying that there's another awkward divide between the children of immigrants, basically my generation, and the elders. And the elders, generally speaking, they have established the masajid. They're the ones that are, the ones in charge. And yet they also have, generally speaking, latent racism. And it's difficult. There's an internal struggle going on between the second generation, between those born and raised here, versus those that are in charge of the masajid. So she's asking for advice. How does one respectfully challenge the elder committees, the uncles, if you like, or those that are the ones that establish them? Because there's this double dichotomy of we wanting to execute the change, and yet we're not fully in charge of the very masajid that we want to do the change in.
Alhamdulillah, that's a wonderful and very thoughtful question. I think we respect the contributions made by the elders. We understand their mentality, because they grew up in areas where a lot of times there's a lot of even implicit biases in terms of race. Sometimes it's not even race, it's more skin color. So there's a lot of color consciousness. That's not full-blown racism, but just discriminatory ways of thinking based just on skin color amongst people who would technically be the same race or the same ethnicity. And bypass it as much as possible. We could try to make a dyed-in-the-wool Desi uncle, for lack of a better term, join Black Lives Matter. Good luck. Or we can just bypass that and say, listen, us shabab, our youth in this masjid, we're going to do what we know we have to do to make a difference, and we're going to respectfully ask the more established uncles and aunties, if you will, to just help us financially. We're not going to try to change their mind. And so, but we're going to have conversations to let them know that we understand where they're coming from. Someone recently, by way of example, mentioned to me that they're having this battle in their family where their parents are very much, look what's happening in Kashmir is far worse than what's happening to African Americans in this country. And so they're battling, and that's an argument we don't have to have. We can say, listen, in that context, that's very real, and we understand that. And we're doing everything we can to help in that situation. But we live here, and our existence here, and the way that we benefit economically has been paved. The road, the smooth road we have, has been paved by the struggle of our African American brothers and sisters, and even the financial strength of the country that we benefit from disproportionately in terms of those we might denigrate in some ways, shapes, or forms. That was based on their blood, sweat, and tears. And 20% of them, conservative estimate of those slaves, African slaves, were Muslims. So there's a debt that we owe.
Sorry guys, this is a connection issue from the Shaykh's side. The internet connection.
The oppression in Kashmir or Rohingyas or anything else, but we are here. And there's a debt that we owe here in addition to whatever else we might be struggling to overcome.
And Shaykh, as a personal example as well, when I posted on Facebook about any issue about what's going on and the riots and whatnot, inevitably a percentage of the comments, not a large percentage, but a percentage that is not negligible, it's posting about, why are you mainly concerned about this when we have Palestine? Why are you talking about this issue when Syria exists? And there is this notion that we're not prioritizing what needs to be prioritized. And of course, we understand that this is a classic example of whataboutery. What about this? What about that? And for us as Muslims, you know, the اعطِ كل ذي حق حقه, give everyone its due. It's not a matter of either or. You know, right now is a time we're going to do, inshallah, one project that needs to be done, and inshallah, we're going to continue doing the other projects. And they're not just thrown in the back burner.
Exactly. Also, I think we need to understand that what difference as a community have we really made as American Muslims to resolving the issue in Palestine, resolving the issue in Kashmir, in India in general? Now all of India is Kashmir. All of these issues, what difference have we really made? I think we need to understand, if we establish strong relationships, particularly with the African American community, who can relate to what's happening in Palestine better than the African American community here. If you establish those relationships and build those bridges, the return for Muslims is disproportionately greater than what we invest in these relationships. The Japanese Americans, because of the experience of Japanese Americans in internment camps, etc., Peter Honda, at every level, the Japanese American community has been with us post 9/11 at every level, in every imaginable way, shape, and form. And then I'll stop because then we have other questions. But Imam Tahir Anwar, who's a beloved friend of both of us, a beautiful Muslim and a beautiful human being, Imam Tahir hosted a meeting in his masjid at, I think it was the 5th anniversary of 9/11, and then there was a candlelight walk from there to the Buddhist temple. And so I spoke at the program, and I said that until we are as moved by 300,000 Japanese who were killed during the 2 atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki and the firebombing of Tokyo, as we are by 3,000 Americans who lost their lives in those towers, then we're not truly human. Just saying that, the Japanese Americans invited me to be the keynote speaker at their commemoration of the ending of the internment during World War II. And so just expressing simply in solidarity to people here and recognizing the struggle of people here that are our fellow citizens and people we share this land with, can reap incredible dividends and returns in terms of being effective in addressing those issues overseas.
Jazakumullah khair. Shaykhana, we have a brother who sent this question, is that the Desi and Arab Muslims reach out to the African American communities, and it appears that there's just this token reaching out. In other words, they're doing it for the sake of doing it. They're doing it for the sake of looking good. So how can we overcome this tokenism and form genuine, meaningful bonds between the African American community and between the, for lack of a better term, immigrant? And by the way, Shaykhana, this term immigrant, it doesn't quite apply to those born and raised here. We're like the sons and daughters of immigrants, but that's another issue there, yeah.
That's why I mentioned earlier, immigrant-based.
Yes, immigrant base, yes.
Anyway, but listen, everyone knows a phony when they see one. And so if you're sincere and you go to the closest masjid that might be predominantly run and populated by African Americans, you go to the Imam or you go to one of the people in charge there or who has influence there, and you sit down and say, listen, we want to really establish some long-term programs and relationships. This current crisis might be the spark, but we know as soon as the media attention dies down and it's out of the news cycle, a lot, not all of the concerns going to die down. So let's sit down and put together some meaningful programs, and whatever resources we have, financial and otherwise, we'll share with the resources that you have, and let's get something done. If you're sincere, believe me, people will know it.
MashaAllah, that's beautiful. So just ikhlas, the barakah of ikhlas, MashaAllah. That's really a beautiful advice, MashaAllah. But Shaykhna, is there any specific program or agenda? Is there anything that you can give us more concrete from your own experiences about how we can, okay, we lost the connection again. Sorry, Shaykhna, I think you again. Yeah, I think your connection, Shaykhna, is breaking off every few minutes. But any meaningful programs that, from your own experiences, having obviously toured the country and whatnot.
I mentioned earlier the zakat program. That's something I think in all of our communities we can do, where there's a surplus of zakat or a deficit in terms of people who are zakat eligible. Reach out and establish a program with communities where many members of those communities or people and Muslims they know might or are zakat eligible. So a zakat program, joint educational programs. I think in Memphis, where you were formerly Sheikh Yasir, some of the brothers and teachers from the Midtown Mosque, Ashir, Imam Hamza, were teaching classes at the Islamic school,
Pleasant View School, yeah.
We're giving khutbahs at the masjid, at your masjid, and other masjids, and for lack of a better term now, we'll come up with a better one, immigrant-based masjids. So providing those platforms, and that's one of the best things we could do. Like our dear sister, Ustada Aisha Prime, right now is probably one of the most recognized and appreciated female scholars and lecturers in this country right now.
Very true.
She provided a platform by Darul Hijra, an immigrant-based community. And so giving talented individuals platforms, scholarships for children to the Islamic school. It's not funny when preacher Moss can make a joke about the local Muslim school. It's this and that and this and that, and they have 3 black children. And it resonates with us. And might not be as wealthy. Zakat programs, joint zakat program, providing platforms for sharing educational. Yourself, Sheikh Yasir, when you were in New Haven, I think you had a Sirah class and probably other classes that were greatly appreciated. And what it did, it brought the communities together in the inner city masjid. So my understanding, you have people coming from West Haven, you have the people living there in New Haven, and so the fact that the masjid gave you that platform was a great means to bring people together. So there are all sorts of things we can do, and I think maybe we can put this in writing as opposed to just on the fly. But we mentioned some things I think are pretty concrete. For starters, we can write this out, inshallah.
MashaAllah, really good suggestion, Shaykhna. Shaykhna, listen, some awkward questions here as well now. We know for a fact that there are Muslim businesses that are run predominantly in African American communities that are benefiting from the situation and doing things that are somewhat unethical and immoral in terms of what they're selling. And these businesses are owned by people that are sometimes giving to the mosques of the immigrant communities, and yet they're doing things that are very unethical. And I mean, again, even in this case of George Floyd, I mean, I'm not speaking about that particular business owner, but the dynamics were definitely, you have the shop owner who's from one community, and then what's happening is with another community. And again, I'm not reading into that particular case. I know it's more complicated, but I'm speaking overall of this very well-known, very awkward dynamics of certain people taking advantage of their background and their wealth and selling, and let's be honest here, alcohol, pork, and gambling, lottery, yeah, that's very, very awkward, issues here. So let's address this issue, Shaykhana. What do you advise both sides of the aisle here when it comes to these types of businesses?
I'm not in denial concerning that. Briefly in Oakland, it was short-lived, but we had an effort to, we even had demonstrations going store to store. I forget the name of it. I still have the banner, but over 80% of the alcohol franchisees in this San Francisco Bay Area are Yemeni Muslims. And you could go to communities, Chicago, they're Palestinian or the Egyptians, and so this is a real problem. A bigger problem there was that the Oakland Tribune, the community, the major newspaper there, did a study where a large percentage of homicides took place in the immediate vicinity of these alcohol stores. And you'll go into some stores, there's a rack of alcohol, and above that, هذا من فضل ربي. And so this is what we did, though. We proposed alternatives that convinced some store owners that this is destroying these communities. It's giving Islam a bad name amongst some of its strongest allies. We know historically African Americans have been the most receptive to Islam. But this is being used by certain groups, black nationalists and others, to drive a wedge between the community and Islam. So what we did, and we were successful in a few instances, was to educate and encourage selling healthy food, healthy produce, because these communities where you have these stores, many of them run by Muslims, they're food deserts. And so you can't get produce, you can't get fresh fruits, you can't get alternative, make connections with vendors to bring in different set of products, and this urging repentance, and we were able to get some to move away from that. So I think it's just a question of organized pressure coupled with presenting an alternative, and then reminding people of their religion. Everyone in the whole chain of selling alcohol is cursed from beginning to end. And so just educating, presenting alternative, educating in terms of programs that are available. A lot of people don't know this. The Small Business Administration formerly did not provide small business loans to alcohol franchisees. They changed their rule to empower the Yemeni community in the Bay Area to set up alcohol franchises to provide a more solid financial foundation for that community that have been agrarian workers in the Central Valley. And the first martyr in Cesar Chavez's movement was a Yemeni Muslim, Naji Dayfullah. He was killed working with Cesar Chavez and Dolores Huerta in the United Farm Workers movement. So there were positive contributions, but generally the Yemenis were poor community janitors, low-level service workers, and the SBA changed their rules to allow them to obtain liquor licenses to economically empower them, but it came at the expense of relationships with the inner city African American communities.
And the sad reality, Shaykhana, is that most of the donations that come, I shouldn't say most, but many of the largest donations, especially the cash donations, and I've seen this with my own eyes, because these stores deal with cash. And so when the masjid needs to be built, these owners have plenty of cash, and they're able to basically give them cash donations to build the masjid. And I even spoke to one of the imams, like, how can you accept this money coming from this person? You know what he's doing. And he just sheepishly shrugged and he's like, inshallah, Allah will repent and whatnot. So we are complicit. I mean, we are complicit when we accept money from people whom we know are selling alcohol, taking advantage. And the irony of ironies, many of them in their personal lives, they think they're righteous. They don't touch alcohol themselves. The irony of ironies, they're 5 times praying 5 times a day. And they think that what they're doing is not really a big deal and they're just, taking advantage of it. So I think those of us that are on the other side of the aisle, we need to police our own. And we need to be proactive. Those amongst us who own liquor stores and they're selling drugs and they're selling alcohol and they're selling gambling and filth. A'udhu billah, Allah Azza wa Jal calls it, the Prophet called it Ummul Khaba'ith, and Allah Azza wa Jal called it filthy. And we cannot allow them just to, turn a blind eye. We need to police ourselves in this regard. Now again, this is a generic talk. I'm not speaking specifically about what happened in Minnesota. That's not, we're just talking about generally this is a sad reality across the country.
And again, it takes action from both sides. We boycotted a store in New Haven, but when Masjid al-Islam was on Dixwell Avenue, one of the brothers, he started selling alcohol. We said, listen, we will go to New York, to the fish. We will bring you fish. You will sell more fish than you will in alcohol. And the brother said, you don't know how hard I worked to get my liquor license. And so we boycotted him, and the Muslims, we had an effective boycott of that store. So we need to start boycotting. We need to start shaming. We need to start calling attention. These proprietors might belong to, as you mentioned.
Jazakumullah khair. Shaykhana, let's get to now, we only have 2-3 questions left, but these are now some of the juicier ones. In light of all that is happening, what is your take on protests? And we still have people in our community that are stating fatwa that protests are not allowed. And that's from the theological side. Then we have the other side, which is in terms of pros and cons. Forget the theology. Suppose we think that protests are mubah, which is my position. Then the issue comes, should we, at this point in time, be protesting what is happening? Should we want the Muslims to be at the forefront, given the very dangerous realities of police brutality against the protesters? And we have a brother from Germany, actually, who literally said, what is your perspective on political violence? Is it justified from a religious and socio-political paradigm, given that many, if not all, successful movements around the globe always had an element of political violence to achieve their goals? Very tough question, Shaykhana, but it needs to be asked in this difficult climate.
Let's take them one at a time. First, the permissibility of protests. I think it will be very difficult to make a strong case that protests are haram or even makruh. And I think you can make a case that they're mustahab or even in some situations wajib. So, and I think our history is replete with many of our leading ulama who led public protests against the oppressive authorities. So I think that would be a hard argument to make. Wallahu alam. And so I would say protests are definitely permissible. And I think in this moment, especially for our young people, it's something encouraged in the sense that with some of their peers as Muslims. So they should be there as identifiably as Muslim. I think it allows them, if we tell our young people, you can't protest, it's too dangerous, you can't do this, you can't, and certainly if we know there's going to be violence, so we shouldn't encourage them to go. But most of these protests overwhelmingly are peaceful protests. Overwhelmingly. The ones that are violent make the news. So the one that's violent make the news. The 500 that aren't newsworthy. If it bleeds, it leads. So I think there are certain benefits, but it's a case-by-case basis. We shouldn't have a blanket, the community needs to mobilize and go out into the streets. We have to have a division of labor. We have to realize some of our people, like the young folks,
the young folks are far more, they have the energy, they have the motivation, and they don't have the responsibility. If one of our college students gets thrown in jail for a few days, we'll make a lot of dua and bail them out. But if someone who's working, taking care of a family, gets thrown into jail, and then in this climate, that charge gets elevated to a felony, and they lose their job, and now their family's in jeopardy, especially in this coronavirus economy. So this economic meltdown hasn't gone anywhere. It's still with us. And so we have to have a division of labor. Which elements in our community should we accept and try to accommodate their desire to protest? Who should we shield from that? If we know there's going to be the possibility, even a slim possibility, should we have our women and children going out there? So, we have to have a division of labor. Some of our community are very effective writers. So I don't want to see you, if you're an effective writer, out at a protest. You should be at home writing a very powerful argument based on the news you get and the feedback you get. That's going to touch the hearts of thousands, or even tens of thousands, or hundreds of thousands of individuals, because you took the time to take advantage of the skill set that you have. And so that's one. The second one, what was the second question? That was a series. The last one was political
The perspective
violence.
on the concept of political violence.
Okay, political violence. I think in our day and time, we have to be very careful, because, and I think I would not agree that every successful movement has come about as a result of political violence. Certainly the American Revolution, the French Revolution, the English Revolution, the Civil War that actually, amongst other things, resulted in the abolition of slavery in this country. Those movements, the Russian Revolution, or the Bolshevik Revolution, there was violence in those revolutions. But not all change has resulted as a result of political violence. The civil rights movement in this country, there was a non-violent movement. Gandhi's movement in India, and when we mention Gandhi, we should not neglect mentioning Badshah Khan, Abdul Ghaffar Khan, and the Northwest Frontier area. That these were non-violent movements. The Khuda Khidmatgar, the movement that Abdul Ghaffar Khan started, was more instrumental in breaking the back of British very, very careful. The epitome of political violence, ISIS, what did that result in? The whole region's torn apart. All of these young people from encouraged to go there to just lose their lives, to accomplish nothing. And so I think we have to really assess what's happening in Yemen. I'm justified in my violence, be I a Houthi or Zaidi, be I a Sunni, be I whatever faction, Emirati, Saudi, Iranian, other proxies manipulating their forces. It's a total mess, a total humanitarian disaster, no light at the end of the tunnel, and everyone feels they're justified, and everyone's saying, La ilaha illallah, Muhammad Rasulullah. I think as Muslims, we have to step back and understand what resources we have, and our resources in terms of our maximum effect. Does it lie with violence? We're at a severe disadvantage in any struggle, were it not for world public opinion and ultimately for the mercy and lutf of Allah. What would stop the Israelis from making all of Palestine, the West Bank, Gaza, cast iron, or cast lead, or iron dome? What would stop the United States from nuking like some of these crazy politicians are actually saying. We don't have any strategic resources as Muslims to stop them. And so when we're talking about violence, we have to look at what are the long-term implications of where our strength, and then what does violence, and specifically racism, what did Malcolm say? Malcolm is an astute political observer. No one would deny that. And some people thought Malcolm got it wrong on race. But he said from Mecca, very famously, perhaps if I've seen these Muslims whose eyes were the bluest of blue, whose hairs was the brownest of brown, whose skin was the whitest of white, coming together as brothers with all their other brothers, and they didn't have that racism in them. So perhaps if the white man in America could study Islam and could become Muslims, they would end the race problem. Some people, oh, Malcolm was being hyperbolic. He was just overwhelmed by the Hajj experience. So what about Arnold Toynbee? Well, probably, arguably, the greatest historian of the 20th century, Islam and the West. His famous essay, Islam can offer the West two things: a solution to the problem of alcoholism, by extension, drug addiction, and a solution to the race problem. But violence undermines the receptivity of Western people to that solution. And so I think this is a deep issue that we really have to think deeply about. And people defending themselves, absolutely, that's a God-given right. But when you're talking about violence in the service of a political agenda and expecting that to result in positive change, I think the recent history of our ummah doesn't bode well in terms of the pushing that particular solution. Saying that, I'm not questioning any people's decisions to resist their particular oppression in ways that they and their...
Zaid, Shaykhna, again, another very frank question. A lot of the protests are being dismissed by members of our own community because of the looting that is going on social media. And again, I'm just telling it like it is. Like, people are very skeptical, very dismissive of the protests overall, simply because of the clips, the YouTube clips, the WhatsApp. And again, I'll be honest, it's going within our own communities. I myself have been forwarded by people that like, oh, look at these people and whatnot. And this is meant as a indirect dismissal of the entire agenda. So again, I want to address this head on. How do we address this looting and this hooliganism that we're seeing from some protesters? What do you say to our audience that are dismissing the entire protest and the movement because of those incidents?
Number one, the overwhelming number of protests are peaceful protests. My nieces and nephews are organizing some of these protests here in Connecticut. I know that they are not members of any radical organization. There are people with talent and skills and organizing ability whose hearts have been touched. The violence is a small fraction of primarily provocateurs, from the right and the left. From the left, the black bloc, who are anarchists, and Antifa, the anti-fascist group in Oakland, California. And I'm on sabbatical. That's why I'm not in Oakland. And I'm riding out. We shut down the college. I'm riding out the storm close to.
MashaAllah.
You'll see most of the people at these protests are European Americans, because African Americans avoid them for the simple reason that these groups like the Black Bloc and anarchist groups, and now from the right, you have white supremacists, you have the Boogaloo Boys, you have White Lives Matter, which is a neo-Nazi group, fomenting and engaging in a lot of this violence to discredit the genuine elements of the movement. And this is documented. I would say that the Muslims who are taking the position you just articulated have allowed themselves to be affected by this strategy. And so we have to understand the overwhelming majority of people out there are just ordinary people who have been touched by an historic moment. These moments don't come every day. A moment that God touches our hearts, black, white, rich, poor, across the political spectrum. Look, Mad Dog Mattis just wrote in the Atlantic a condemnation of our president and his defending the protesters. And so if Muslims don't have the consciousness of Mad Dog Mattis in this moment, something's wrong, brothers and sisters. We have to see it for what it is. These are provocateurs. And then the news, it's not newsworthy to show hundreds or thousands of peaceful people just marching up and down. And what's his name? George Floyd. That's not newsworthy. It's newsworthy when a handful somewhere in this country, and be it in New York, elsewhere, starts looting. And if I could say one other thing on this issue of violence, a lot of times it's the police and or the National Guard and or in Lafayette Park, the U.S. military that precipitates the violence. In Lafayette Park, before Trump's famous photo op with the Bible, it was peaceful. People were there minding their business. And then here comes the military, here comes the troops, here comes the tear gas, here comes the helicopters buzzing them 20 feet above their heads, military helicopters. So that violence was provoked by the elements that we're protesting against. The elements of systemic racism and violence. So we should be very careful.
And subhanAllah, Shaykhana, the reality is that these same elders that are forwarding these WhatsApp messages and, having that attitude, they don't realize they're falling prey to the exact same attitude that they criticize when Islamophobes say that Islam is a violent religion because of the actions of a few people. They're doing the exact same stereotyping without even recognizing and realizing it. I know, Shaykhana, you have to go. I have one major question and a very quick one at the end. The last major question we have, and again, I apologize because these are very frank questions, but they need to be asked. We have a number of people saying that, isn't it problematic to join the hashtag Black Lives Matter, given that there are agendas that are not necessarily Islamic, and of course the issue of gender and sexuality always comes up. And so instead of being led by other banners and other institutions, shouldn't Muslims have their own protests and their own separate agendas and banners so that we don't seem to ally with some causes that might not necessarily be our own? So what do you say to that, Shaykhna?
I say at a certain level, definitely it's protest, and you can go to that peaceful protest as a Muslim, identifiably as a Muslim. You can carry a sign that has a Quranic verse or a hadith that's relevant to the situation. Why wouldn't you go? That's not saying you're a card-carrying member of Black Lives Matter and you endorse the movement that was started by 3 queer black women, etc., yada, yada, yada. That's not, we have to be able to have the sophistication to separate the apples from the oranges and to understand in general, what are those levels where even as a distinct Muslim organization, so we start Muslims Against Racist Violence. That's our organization. And there's going to be a mobilization, a peaceful mobilization to call attention to this issue, coupled with a lot of other behind the scenes political work, as happened in Ferguson. Now we have the first African American mayor in Ferguson. There was a total makeover of the city council, etc. So there's a lot of behind the scenes, out of the spotlight action going on. And then there's pressure being put in the street. FDR famously said when I think Bayard Rustin or A. Philip Randolph went and said, we want A, B, C, and D, he said, okay, that's great. Now get out in the street and make me do it. In other words, create some public pressure, some visible pressure that will give me leverage to go to these millionaires and say, listen, if you don't give up a little of your wealth to support these New Deal programs, you might lose it all to this to a revolution. And so that pressure was effective. So if we're being invited to be part of that pressure, asked us, someone interviewing us, do you stand for everything Black Lives Matter? This is CBS News, Mr. Muslim, Mrs. Muslim. You're saying, no, I don't. I disagree with A, B, C, and D, but I share the concern of institutionalized violence in our society that disproportionately affects some members of our community, African Americans specifically in this instance, as opposed to others. Again, Mad Dog Mattis, he said, equal protection of the law under the law is a constitutional principle that we should all support. And so as Muslims, we benefit from equal protection under the law. And if we stand silent when the continued assault, we shouldn't forget the Patriot Act was primarily designed to deny Muslims equal protection under the law. And there were a whole lot of Muslims, people who weren't Muslims, such as the Center for Constitutional Rights in New York, that were taking the lead in advocating for the eradication of a lot of the more draconian measures in the Patriot Act, taking the lead in advocating for the Muslims who are unjustly incarcerated at Guantanamo. And so when it's time for us to reciprocate, Michael Ratner was not a Muslim. He and some of the other members, there were some Muslims at the Center for Constitutional Rights, but he's not a Muslim.
So, Shaykh,
we would probably disagree with a lot of things Muslims advocate personally, but he understood the issues are deeper than those points of difference, and the benefit accrues to all of us. And so I think Muslims have.
So, Shaykhana, a very specific question then. As Imam Zaid Shakir
to the last question.
I know, I have two more very quickly. As Imam Zaid Shakir to your fellow Muslims that look up to you as a fiqhi, as an Islamic point, should we be using the hashtag Black Lives Matter?
I think as Muslims we shouldn't be.
Okay, that's what I want to. Go ahead.
That does not preclude us from joining an action that might include some people from Black Lives Matter, because otherwise there's no action to join.
Okay, last question, Shaykh, and I know you have to go as well. Final question to you.
And to join an action doesn't mean you have to use the hashtag.
Of course, yes. So final question, Shaykh, what specific books and documentaries would you advise our viewers to read and to watch so that they can better educate themselves, we can better educate ourselves about the reality of the situation?
A good starting point is President Obama's live stream yesterday. It's about an hour, 25 minutes. It's not all President Obama, but it's a lot of young people who are strategizing to address these issues, address issues such as qualified immunity, where the Supreme Court basically has given the police the latitude to kill anyone with impunity, to address issues like qualified immunity, to address issues such as the militarizing of our police forces. There's an excellent talk by a former IDF soldier. I forget his name. I just heard it today in my car, so I didn't get the details. But there's a lot out there that we can take advantage of to educate ourselves about these. Look at YouTube. I think you can find the documentary.
Shaykh, you got cut off there. Can you repeat that documentary name? You got cut off for a minute.
Eyes on the Prize.
Eyes on the Prize. The oil one.
No. Not the oil one. This
is
the history of African American people.
Oh, sorry. Okay, so there's another one there. Okay, so and how about 13th? Would you recommend that?
The oil one is just plain The Prize.
The Prize. You're right. You're absolutely right. My mind got messed up there. And how about the 13th? That documentary.
13th absolutely is another one, to just see how the effects of mass incarceration. Michelle Alexander, her book, The New Jim Crow. I think this is must reading, because again, it goes through the history of slavery, Jim Crow, mass incarceration, and now in her introduction, she discusses this issue of police violence. So I think that's absolutely essential. But in conclusion, if there are no more questions.
Yeah, so your concluding thought, Shaykhna.
Conclusion, we have to, as Muslims, not allow ourselves to become bitter and to embody, to become the hate that hate produced. We should not allow the hate that we're witnessing and the actions of the likes of that officer Chauvin and his accomplices, or those two men who stalked Ahmaud Arbery, or we should not allow that hatred to make us hateful. We hate what people do. We hate actions that are haram and forbidden. We don't hate people per se. And that's one of the reasons when some of the most hateful anti-Muslim figures, such as Hind or Abu Sufyan or Amr bin al-As or Khalid bin al-Walid, who had killed the most beloved companions of the Prophet ﷺ. Hind hired the assassins, and when they left their hateful actions, ahlan wa sahlan, you're part of my community. Ahlan wa sahlan wa marhaban. Welcome to you. And so we have to have that magnanimity of spirit, and we have to understand all communities are affected by this violence. African Americans are affected disproportionately. No denying that. And it represents a lack of equal protection under the law. But other communities are affected. Twice as many European Americans are killed every year by police in this country than African Americans. And so what does that mean? That means we have to create a kind of movement, and this is a challenge for Muslims. We want a movement that can bring us all together. And that's what's happening in the streets. You see all races. President Obama and his introductory remarks yesterday, he said something that we should reflect on. He said that the people marching in the 60s were pretty much a monolith. The African American community mobilized in the South and the North, overwhelmingly. Today, the people marching, the African Americans, European Americans, Latinos, on the week that Alton Sterling was shot in Louisiana, and Philando Castile in his car with his fiance and his little baby, I think it was his daughter, shot in his car legally for mentioning he had a legal weapon. Yeah. During that week, 5 Latinos were killed in California, Nevada, and Arizona. And so not to dismiss, and especially the history. Not to dismiss that, but to say this affects us all. This is a scourge that affects all of us, and it's going to take all of us coming together to end it. Otherwise, we just won't have the critical mass. And so if we as Muslims can do anything, I think we can tap into the teachings of our religion that have been historically the most effective force in terms of bringing people from different backgrounds and races together, from the first community that brought Salman al-Farisi, Suhaib al-Rumi, and the Arabs, and Bilal al-Habashi, the African, the Asian, the European, the Arabs, all together in a unified community under the banner of La ilaha illallah, going forth as a positive moral force in the world. And I think this is what we Muslims should be focusing on right now. Under the banner of La ilaha illallah, all of us going together to play our part in bringing our country together. And we doing it under the banner of La ilaha illallah.
Alhamdulillah. Shaykhana, in conclusion, it's at times of chaos, it's at times of complete fitna and turmoil that sensible leadership is the most needed. And I thank Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala for blessing the American Muslim community with someone like yourself. وَلَا نُزَكِّي عَلَى اللَّهِ أَحَدًا I thank Allah Azza wa Jal for the wisdom, the sensibility that you bring to the table. You are truly a blessing and an asset to the American Muslim community. And I ask Allah Azza wa Jal to protect and preserve you and all of us, and ask Allah Azza wa Jal to give you and all of us ikhlas and sincerity, and ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to allow you to be guided and to guide others through you and to all of us. Jazakumullahu khair, Shaykh, for your time. Inshallah, I hope that we can continue these conversations and inshallah at better times as well. So may Allah Azza wa Jal bless you and your family. May Allah Azza wa Jal.
One more quick piece of advice.
Faddal, any time from you, Shaykh. Yes.
Brothers and sisters, as Shaykh Yasir said, these times they try us. No one has the whole answer. Just keep close. 3 items. Keep your mushaf, your Quran close at hand. Keep your prayer rug, your sajjada close. And if you use a subha or masbaha, keep that close. If not, get your fingers busy. Dhikr, Quran, and salah. When the Prophet ﷺ was agitated by an affair, he immediately went to pray. So may Allah bless us to be a prayerful, remembering, Quranic community. Barakallahu feekum. Assalamu alaikum.
Jazakumullah khair. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Apologies for the technical issues, but inshallah ta'ala, overall the message was given, and inshallah we hope to continue conversations with Imam Zaid and others. Inshallah we'll see you next time. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.
إن المسلمين والمسلمات والمؤمنين والمؤمنات والقانتين والقانتات والصادقين والصادقات والصابرين والصابرات والخاشعين والخاشعات والمتصدقين والمتصدقات والصائمين والصائمات والحافظين فروجهم والحافظات والذاكرين الله كثيرا والذاكرات أعد الله لهم مغفرة وأجرا عظيما.